I didn't start out to write a book. I wrote because I wanted to write, because I felt I had to write. And so I wrote over 2 years, 2.5 years. I wrote from within about 2 or 3 weeks of Chris dying. And so most of the writing in the book, or much of it, comes from writing I did at the time, rather than sitting here 3 years later looking back. And I had no intention of writing a book, but I did publish some of what I'd written on a blog, really because I'm a very sloppy journal writer. If I just write in a journal, nothing much happens. I need some sense of audience to really draw writing out of me, to have any quality. So I published it, and some people said they liked it and that they found it helpful. And there came a point where I thought, well, perhaps it would be useful to put it into a book. So I started writing the book in July last year, and I guess I'd finished it really within about 5 or 6 months. Bringing together what I'd written, thinking about it, reflecting on it, and shaping it into a book that could be published. Well, of course, I don't know what other people's journeys are, really, so it's hard to say. And I'm not claiming that mine is special in any way. I think what I came to understand and discovered is that it helped me enormously if I turned towards my grief rather than away from it. A friend of mine talks about turning into the wind, and that's what I tried to do. And I also found that any kind of creative expression I could bring would help. So I think mourning is what we do in response to grief. And grief we have no control over. It comes as and when and how it wants. All we have choice about is how we respond, and that's what we can call mourning. So I tried to bring my whole self to that process, my creative self. And that was partly in writing, prose and poetry, but it was also in travelling and creating a celebration and ritual. So I think that's what's useful, is that I have brought my creative self to mourning, and I found that profoundly helpful. I think there's probably something of value for others in that. That seems to be the sort of thing that people were saying in response to my blogs and poetry. Ritual is a word that's often associated with religion and confused with ceremony. I think ritual is about bringing a particular quality of intention and attention to our actions. And for those people who are part of a faith community who have a strong religious belief, I'm sure that their church or their religious body offers some kind of ritual process. And for some that's satisfying, but for me it wasn't. And so I needed to find my own forms to mark particular things, to mark cremation, for example, to create a celebration, to make a small shrine. I don't mean that in a religious sense, but bringing together a photograph and some artifacts and some things together in one place, and lighting a candle, just to create small daily rituals of paying attention. So I might just sit with the photograph, particularly in the early stages, I might just sit with the photograph and think. And if you're religious, you might call that prayer. If you're non-religious, if you're a secular person, then you might call it meditation or reflection. But you bring to it a kind of quality of attention and intention. And I think it serves a very similar purpose to religious rituals, but for a non-religious person, for a secular person, I think it's more helpful to create your own rituals, whatever feels right for you. I guess it comes from my own experience. I lost my father when I was a boy, young boy, when I was 4 or 5. And my mother dealt with it, as many people of her generation dealt with loss, by a stiff upper lip, by determination to get on with things. So as a child, I never did mourn or grieve for my father. And even when my stepfather and my mother died in turn, I hardly shed a tear for them. And I had a sense of something missing, something wrong almost. And I think when Chris died, and we knew that she was going to die, I had time to think about it. And I had time to make a decision that this would be different. This time I would face into whatever happened, both the death and the aftermath of that. I suppose in a sense I grieved all my losses in one go when Chris died. And there's something about our culture, I think generationally, we're a bit restricted, a bit tight about emotional expression. I think it's less true of, say, my children's generation than mine, and probably, again, slightly less true of my generation than my parents. And I think there was something about that wartime generation that, frankly, just didn't have time to express themselves emotionally and learn not to. That they couldn't if they were to carry on. And I think that rubbed off a little bit on my generation. We've had to learn to reconnect. I was in a pub, which is somewhere I'm not very often, but I was in a pub with someone I know who helped me move some furniture. And he turned to me and he said, how are you doing? Are you getting over this thing? And there was something it was very well meant. It was very well meant, but there's something that I really reacted strongly to it. And I think it connected with this question of having tried to get over the death of my father and discovering that wasn't very helpful. And that, to me, getting over has a sense of putting something behind you, cutting off from it. And getting through it, for me, was something about living with the process of whatever comes up. In the book, I talk about the terra incognita of grief, the unknown land. So we know quite a lot about, because of various studies, about the kind of broad general patterns of grief. But I think every person's grief is unique. And even if it's similar to someone else's in hindsight, you cannot know how it's going to be at the time. So it unfolds as if one were in an unknown land, terra incognita. And facing it, looking at that space is the only way to navigate. And so that's the key difference for me between getting over it and getting through something. Getting through something is acknowledging, is living with, and living fully. And I think paradoxically, my experience has been that in living fully with my grief, I've also been more open to joy. I think the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and people like her who have researched the phenomenon of grief has been hugely valuable. So she and others have established a broad trajectory, a kind of pattern which we might expect to follow. The shock, denial, anger, rage, depression, and potential renewal. And I think it's extremely helpful in terms of understanding the whole gamut of emotions that we may well feel. Where it becomes unhelpful is when we expect to regard it as a model to follow, as if there's a way of doing grief. And then there becomes a potential of doing grief badly or doing grief well, which is ridiculous. And so when we understand it as a range of possible things that are likely to happen to us, I think it's really great. But it doesn't allow for the fact that every person's grief is also unique. Things don't happen in a curve. They happen when they happen. They circle round, they come again. In a sense, one carries grief for a loss the whole of one's life. Well, I don't provide a model or advice or prescription of how to be or what to do. I simply tell a story. I tell my story, and it's a messy story. I share what the experience of grief was like for me and how I tried to face into it and what I did. And what I hope someone reading the book gets, even if they're in the midst of their own deep loss, is a sense of being recognised. That perhaps there's something in what I say that may be also true of their experience. Or at least feel that they're not alone. We all suffer loss. We all suffer grief at some time in our life. And one of the aspects of the phenomenon is that we feel alone very often. In the early stages, people rally around, we know what to do, and then what? Then there's a void stretching out. And I think to have a sense of a fellow traveller is enormously helpful. I found it helpful reading Joan Didion's book, for example, The Year of Living Magically. Not because my experience was the same as hers, it was very different. Because there was another voice talking about loss, talking about their experience, and talking about it truthfully as they could. So I hope that a reader will feel recognised, that they'll feel less alone. And maybe even if they're in the sort of deepest, darkest depths of their grief, they'll see something of the possibility of joy lurking in the shadows. This is Ted, otherwise known as Captain Midnight. He's not shy of speaking for himself. He sometimes writes blogs, and in fact some of his writing is in the book. This little chap here was my saviour in some ways. He appeared on the scene just a few months before Chris died. I thought at the time that I was making it possible for her to have a dog, but I learned from her and from others that she was making certain that he was around for me, to look after me. And he has looked after me wonderfully well. Extraordinary how much depth of connection and love and companionship a dog can give. They're really little love machines. All they want to do is love. And he's been astonishing. And whenever I've been upset, if I've started crying, he will just rush across the room and bury his face in mine and say, "It's all right. You see, I'm a member of the pack. When a member of the pack's in trouble, we help out." So he's quite an extraordinary little beast. He's a bit restless right at the minute, but he's been my companion every day, right throughout all this long process, which is now nearly 3 years. He also makes me see things from a different point of view. So when I'm writing in his voice, and I confess that it is me that writes, not him, then I take a slightly different stance. It gives me a different position to see. I can see myself from outside in all my foolishness. And I can laugh at myself. He helps me laugh at myself a little bit, not take myself quite so seriously. And he brings joy every day. It's a joyful thing. Every morning it's good to wake up and be a dog. I'm going to do that next time round, if there is a next time round. Yes, I write about a workshop that I went on that I found extremely helpful about a year after Chris died. I had some help from a psychologist in the hospital when Chris was very ill. And that was, I saw her about once a week over the last couple of months of Chris's life, 3 months of Chris's life. And just having somewhere I could go and be heard for me was very important. But when Chris died, although the offer was there from the hospice for grief counselling and this, I decided not to. Not because of conviction. I was very open to the idea, and I was very open to picking up on the offer whenever it felt right. But in the beginning, I thought not. I've been in therapy and I've had counselling over many years, and I had found this new way of supporting myself through writing, which seemed to be very helpful. So I didn't feel that need. But about a year in, I did want to do something, and I went on a workshop, a family systems constellations workshop. Again, this is something that I've been working on for some years, so it was familiar, and I knew many of the people there. And it's a way of understanding or trying to understand a situation in the round from many perspectives at once, from the embodied, the physical, to the sort of psyche, the psyche, what's going on in one's own mind and soul, how we connect with other people, what the wider world might have to say about it in terms of what are the archetypes of grief, and then what even beyond that, to the extent that the sense of a divine, or the sense of something bigger, to find a position in relation to all of that. And for me, it was extremely helpful because it enabled me to connect with Chris very viscerally a year after she died. In fact, I did the constellation, I think, a year to the day that she died. And it enabled me to have a kind of conversation with her. So I don't believe in life after death, or any conventional religious view. Except I can imagine her. And to have some way of doing that, to speak, to kind of work out what's our relationship now that she's not here in the world. Because the relationship doesn't end, but it changes. And it was very important to me to have the chance to do that work. I write about it in some detail in the book, and it's too complex to really explain in a short sentence or two. But it was my use, my psychological support, my expert support, if you like, came from that source rather than ongoing counselling or ongoing therapy, both of which can be extremely useful, and which I used myself in the past. But at this time in my life, I wanted to do something rather differently. When you're in a very close, loving relationship with someone and they die, the relationship changes radically. It's sundered in the way how it was. And in a sense, they're everywhere and they're nowhere. One can look around and see their influence and their presence in your life, in the things you bought together, or the decisions you made to paint something, or a picture, or arrangement of furniture, and all sorts of things that you're not aware of suddenly catch you. There's a strong visceral connection, so they're sort of everywhere. But the one thing you cannot do is reach out and hold them. So I think the relationship becomes a relationship with their presence and their absence. But of course, what doesn't change is what you have shared together to the point where they've died. And that's always with you. But one's relationship with the person changes in a way that's, I suppose, more imaginal, more interior. And yet, it's still possible if I choose to have a conversation. Occasionally I do. Sometimes she starts it. And sometimes I think, well, what would Chris say? Or what did you think? When she was alive and we were married and we were together, we'd often ask each other's opinions about things. And you get and often you'd know what the answer would be. because you get to know someone very well. So you can kind of ask the questions, you get the voice back to you, and it's a wonderful support. And it's a way of that person continuing to be in the world in some way, without being maudlin or without trying to be, without being a Miss Havisham and freezing everything in time. That person's influence and presence, in a way, continues. And the glorious thing about it is it's not exclusive. That there are room for other people. It's like having one friend. You don't mean you can't have other friends. One of the things I learned from being with Chris, I think, was about living artfully, about how important it is to bring our whole selves to our lives, our creative selves. In a way, it's all we have to bring in the world. It's the thing that makes us us. What we can make, what we can shape, what we create, that is us. That's the trail, the trace we leave behind us. That's our influence on the world. And yes, it can be playful, but it can be doleful too. I think there's something about creativity which needs us to be in touch with our feelings, and both inwardly but also open to the world. And maybe that's its greatest blessing, that it connects us in that way. So I think, writing a poem or painting a picture or making something is something that takes us both inside and it connects us to something outside. It keeps us in the world, it anchors us in the world. And some people think of themselves or talk about themselves as not being creative. At first, I just think that's not true. We all have creative capacity, it's part of being human. But it's also true that not everyone has great skills. I mean, I can't paint for toffee. Some people feel more or less able to make something or shape something themselves. But I say almost anything can be creative. Even bringing a photograph and some objects together and arranging them is a creative act. Or taking pictures that you take, photographs or images from magazines or something, and making a collage, that's a creative act. Even the way we relate to other people's creativity is creative. So engaging with visual arts, engaging with music, listening, appreciating, connecting, that's all artful living. And I guess it's what I've come to believe is really important. And I think that's that encouragement. I think Chris's voice perhaps was ringing in my ears, and her encouragement, as it had been when she was alive, to write, to do, to make, to shape, continued. It didn't stop when she died. And so trying to find that creative spark, and it was very difficult in the early weeks. It really was difficult. It was a way of honouring her and of honouring our lives together and of living in the way that I come to want to live. And one could be creative in celebration and in mourning. So shaping the cremation service, which was very soon after she died, within 2 weeks. I needed lots of help. I didn't hold the whole thing. I had a really good friend who did that. But he helped me articulate what it is I wanted, what I thought Chris would have wanted, to make it uniquely ours. And it would have been easy to please other people. Other members of the family, other people would have done it differently. But that's not a time to please other people. It's a time to be true to what you think the person would have wanted and what you want. And make it as creative as you want. Have the music you want. Have the words you want. I think by nature I'm a bit of a lone wolf. I'm introverted rather than extroverted. And I have a tendency to hunker down and get on with things. But this was too big for me to do. And I had a sense that the essence of what I wanted to do it would involve other people. So my dear friend Peter helped me shape cremation. When it came to the celebration of Chris's life, which we had 6 months after she died, in which 200 people came over 2 days, we had all sorts of things happening. That was a collective event. I asked a friend of ours to curate it, to help shape it. And I was able to influence what happened and say some things I specifically wanted. But someone else held that space, and we involved people. We brought their creativity into the space. And it seemed to stimulate it stimulated a very generous response from people. People wrote poetry, they came and sang songs, they played music, they made art, they danced, they cooked. And what was fascinating was just how ready people were to accept that invitation, just how much they wanted to do that, to honour Chris and to honour their own feelings of grief and loss and connection, and their love. It's an act of love. So I learned something through this process about how helpful for me it was to invite other people. And I also learned, because I'm a bit dark, a bit dumb about this social stuff, I really learned how much I loved it. And when I took Chris's ashes around the world to different places, often I would meet with someone there, some friend of ours, some friend of hers, someone who'd known us or her, and they would be part of that process too. And that was highly significant. Highly significant. And I think the result for me has been, I have felt sustained by I'm crossing my fingers like this, like an invisible network or mesh of relationships and love. And I think in part that became explicit because of those invitations for people to do things. We have that as experiences in common now. We've shared those things. So that was a very important thing and a big learning for me along the way. I think there's something in it at the moment about allowing ourselves to think more carefully about how we respond to loss. I'm one of the baby boom generation. I'm on the sort of leading edge of the baby boom. And so this big group of people is facing old age and death. It's the next thing on the horizon for the baby boom generation. It's coming. It's around us. People my age have all lost friends. That's how it is. So I think there's a growing awareness of that we have choices about how we deal with it, and that perhaps we will deal with it as a generation differently to the generation of our parents who we've been losing, who've been dying over the last decades. So I think perhaps it's part of that process. I hope it allows people to see, and perhaps it's significant that I'm a man writing it, that men can be open and vulnerable and share what matters. I hope it supports that trend. I hope it encourages people to claim a voice for themselves.